Hello, everybody. We're going to get into the major aspects of the Roman Empire today with this lecture. I wanted to show you this. I'm going to upload this into our class folder just so you have it in case it becomes useful later. But I wanted to show you this really useful animated map. It's just a PowerPoint, really, that when you play it, you can click through the slides. And so when we look at the beginning of what will become Rome, you've got the beginning of the republic right here, way back, very early point before the wars with Carthage and the whole bit. And then you start to click through this thing, and I'm just going to do it now with you here. And there's a timeline over on the right side that corresponds with some of the info that's in the textbook as well, and shows you, of course, the major century right here. It shows you the expansion of the Roman Republic as it expands and continues to expand. And we're about to get to the Caesar era. Here's the first triumvirate: Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. So this is how big the Roman Republic got to, and it was already very big for its day and age. Then we move on, coming into BCE, moving towards CE. Second triumvirate right here. This is the beginning of the actual empire. So by the time we get to right here to one common era, all right, or the first century, so within 0 to 100 of the common era, this is the size of what is now the empire, the Roman Empire. Now let's just keep on going for the fun of it. Trajan made this guy was a really amazing general. He did some amazing things. He's worth reading about. He wrote a book on his exploits just like Caesar did. You see how much of Britain has now been occupied by the Romans. The Romans even have a base up here in Crimea. And then we see the split where the Roman Empire splits into two separate empires ruled by two different emperors. And then we move all the way to the very end, the fall of the Western Empire right here, when Odoacer comes in and overthrows. He's a Germanic king that overthrows the last really, Western Roman emperor. And then the Eastern Roman Empire goes all the way from here, from the 5th century Common Era to 1453. And in 1453, this one in the High Middle Ages is conquered. So that's basically how that comes about. I think that's just to give you an idea of what this is. And we're going to be talking a lot about the empire phase today and the major aspects of its rise and fall. I just wanted you to see this, and if you want to use it, you can use it. It'll be in the Rome module for you. All right, let's get to the actual topic at hand, however. Okay, rise and fall of an empire. Now, the first Roman emperor was Augustus, as you already know if you watched the little bit about Caesar and the transition of the republic into an empire. Augustus, his actual name is Octavian. It's just that Augustus is the name he picked for his emperor's name. And he comes into power 31 years before zero on the Julius calendar. So he wants to try to fix it. The empire, which is too disorderly and hard to manage, is too big for the kind of republic, the kind of government that it has. The Senate is in a bit of a cognitive decline, if you will. It's been around for hundreds of years, and the Senate is no longer functioning very well. And so Augustus/Octavian sees himself as a person that can fix it for the longevity of Rome. And I think he saw himself as kind of I'm shying away from using the word savior. That's not what I mean at all. But as kind of somebody who can at least salvage what Rome is for a while longer. So he does keep the power to himself, but he also allows the Senate to manage whatever it makes sense to have them manage. Basically, if there is a territory that Roman armies are moving into to try to control those territories or to expand those territories, then the emperor is in charge. Any territory that is already peaceful and can just be operated by a civil government, like the Senate, then the Senate is in charge, and that's kind of how he sets it up. So if there's a territory that needs rapid decisions to be made by an emperor, that's where the emperor is going to really shine here. And so here is Augustus Caesar, all right, so Octavian, at 25 BC, a few years after he took over. And here's his empire that he's now in charge of, including Parthia, which is way over here, this really big area that has been a region of strife as of this point. So the emperor is going to be in charge of Parthia, and he's going to be in charge of where Caesar. You don't notice that this has been colored in because it hasn't been on this map, but Caesar's came in here and set up some bases. So the emperor will be in charge of this area, and any other area that is suffering from any kind of hostility. Might also include Gaul. And the Senate will run the rest of it. So the emperor under Augustus takes control of the Roman army directly and takes it away from the Senate. And the emperor is going to use this army to control the troublesome provinces. Okay? In this question here, this shows up. Why were Augustus's reforms more successful than Julius Caesar's? It's real simple. Because he's actually got the approval of the people and of the Senate when he's doing it, whereas Julius Caesar was kind of doing what he did without the approval of the Senate, to the point where the Senate actually murdered him. So, that's probably why. So, some more reforms. He's going to restore traditional Roman values that have been suffering in this time of increasing chaos as the Senate became more and more useless. So the idea of patriotism, close family ties, hard work to make a good, strong state, right? Discipline, simple living. These are all Roman values that he's going to really encourage his people to get involved in. Helps the poor by providing free or low-cost grain. This keeps the poor of the plebeian class very happy, meaning he's got a safety net. He creates a safety net for those that cannot afford to eat. The Senate was unable to do this. So he's able to do it by decreeing it. He's going to sponsor a bunch of public works. In a way, Augustus reminds me a lot of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, during the Great Depression. There's a lot about him that makes me think of that guy. He's kind of a very progressive fixer of things that were wrong, and he does it very efficiently. So roads, buildings, water systems. Basically, Augustus was an excellent emperor. The Roman peace, Pax Romana, this is the idea that under the Roman banner, under the empire, you can live peaceably and successfully. And that's an idea that the Roman Empire will carry with it wherever it goes. And remember, Julius Caesar, the guy before Augustus, is going to have said that everybody that is conquered by Rome can eventually become citizens. Well, now not only can you become a citizen if you're part of the empire, but you have this concept of the Roman peace, that the Romans will bring peace and prosperity to you if you live within the empire as citizens. And that's a big deal. There's actually going to be people that clamor to belong at this point in time to the empire, as opposed to nomadic kingdoms on the outside. The road system is going to rival that you might hear about with the Persians. It's going to be a very good road system. And this road system will link all the way over to China, ultimately. The Silk Road, as you might hear about in world history classes, the Silk Road is something that the Romans are going to connect through Persia all the way over to China. And there's going to be Romans that travel to the courts of China, and there's going to be Chinese citizens that travel to the courts of Rome. So this is a pretty big deal, pretty stable empire. All right. Who comes after Augustus? Well, there's no law of succession yet, which is a problem, actually. There's no, when the emperor dies, who becomes the next emperor? The reality is that the wife of Augustus is going to choose the next few emperors. She's just going to say, okay, your turn, until she dies. And then they actually have to come up with a real rule on how you become an emperor of Rome. So Tiberius is actually going to be the next one. He's Augustus's stepson, and he's going to be a pretty decent general and emperor. Caligula, He is kind of a weird one. All right, he's a little bit nuts. 37 to 41. He's not an emperor for long. You'll notice, right? 37 to 41. Cruel, incompetent, bizarre. He made his horse a dictator consul, and the royal guard. This is something that used to happen in Turkey until recently. The royal guard is going to be the last bastion of deciding whether or not an emperor is safe or not. And if an emperor became unsafe, actually became this bad as Caligula does, then it was the royal guard that would actually kill the emperor so that a new emperor can take over. And that's something the royal guard is going to be doing for hundreds of years. They are basically they are they are the protectors of the emperor. But if the emperor becomes bad for the empire, then the royal guard will revert to becoming the protectors of Rome as opposed to the emperor alone. So I find that to be a fascinating thing. Claudius is an interesting character, a scholar chosen by the royal guard. All right, so the royal guard of Rome actually picked this guy to be a good successor to the messed up Caligula, and so he's a educated man, restores order and stability, and sponsors a lot of military expeditions, including going further than Caesar did into Britain. So Claudius is going to be pretty good. Now let's get to the rest of them, just this list of emperors, right? Nero, 54 to 68. Nero was a mess, all right? He was kind of like, uh, let's go to this guy here again. He was kind of like Caligula, okay? So Nero, 54 to 68. You often hear stories about Rome on fire, burning, while Nero's playing a harp or a type of musical instrument in a bathtub as Rome burns, that kind of thing. There's some that say that he was the one that actually set the fires, or had them set. There's a lot of conspiracy theories surrounding Nero, but it's because he was a emperor who was very unstable. He was also a little bit insane, we think, may have been suffering from a disease of the brain. And it is believed by many that he started this fire which destroys Rome. Now, the funny thing is that the destruction of Rome, which was a lot of tenements and big wooden buildings and all that, that the destruction of that allowed Rome to be rebuilt, meaning the city of Rome, not the entire empire, allowed the city of Rome to be rebuilt in a much nicer, cleaner fashion than the way it had been before, as it just expanded as this big city over time. So honestly, it was a more beautiful city as a result of the burning, but of course, it was a horrible disaster. A lot of people died in it, right? And Nero basically had set up a period of time during his reign where the chaos allowed that to even happen. Anyway, he's going to commit suicide when the army actually rises up against him because of how bad of a ruler he was. That leads us to a bunch of expansionists, emperors who are going to expand the size of Rome. So, Vespasian, 69 to 79 Common Era, restores discipline to the army and government again. There's these cycles where you have a couple of good emperors and then kind of a nutso one, and then a couple of good emperors and then a nutso one, right? It's just kind of happens that way. He puts down rebellions in the extremities where there's always seems to be rebellions when emperors go bad and don't really manage things well. And so Gaul and Judea are the two places where rebellions were almost assured to happen if an emperor was not good at being an emperor. Nerva, he's going to actually create the here's how we have our successor. So he's going to make things a bit better. This is the one good thing he does, really, because he's not known for much else except um, basically creating a system of succession. Trajan, who has this huge victory column that still exists, his legacy is still around, and you can read a book that he wrote about his exploits. And I recommend it if you're into military stuff or whatever. If you're going to read the book on Caesar, the book by Caesar, I should say, you should read the book by Trajan as well, because his understanding of military tactics and on how people work is really remarkable. And he makes a very good empire as well, expands it much larger than what it had been. So this is the Roman Empire at a very peaceful time and at its greatest extent, and that's because of Trajan there. he's able to do this. So massive empire by the time we have him. When he's gone, the empire stays big for a while, then very slowly but surely declines. You have to remember one thing about Rome. The way your armies worked, if you remember this from the Republic lecture, the way your armies worked is that you had to expand because your armies, when they retired, when your soldiers retired, they got land. Remember that part? So the problem is it's kind of a self-defeating prophecy. Romans have low taxes at this point in time because the money to fund the empire comes from conquest, and the money to pay your soldiers comes from conquest, and the retirement for your soldiers comes from conquest. So if you get this big, you're doing great. Look at all the land for all your soldiers and all the stuff. But at some point, it gets too big. At some point, you can't go any further and still manage it. And this is as big as Rome can ever really get and still be able to manage itself as an effective empire. Okay, so Hadrian, he's got to actually hold on to all this after Trajan dies. And so Hadrian, the biggest problem he has is dealing with the Scots up here, the Scottish tribespeople up here. Like everybody has always had that problem if you're king of England before the 1700s, really. And so he builds a big wall, actually right here, Hadrian's Wall. So he's famous for that. And it's this huge wall. It's a 73-mile wall, and you can go see lots of it today. It's still fairly intact. And he had a whole army, a whole legion, just manning that wall over there in Britain. And here's some images of Hadrian's Wall. What a major works project, and it kept some of his armies busy for many years. You know, that was one way to make sure your armies weren't getting bored and either bad at being soldiers or getting rebellious through their boredom, is you kept them busy, right? And so he did this. Marcus Aurelius, I find him to be a fascinating guy. I think a very good emperor too. And he had a neat idea for the future. He basically a Greek Stoic, you know, the way he's been trained. And Marcus Aurelius, we often call him the last of the good emperors because he really wanted to see peace in Rome. He wanted to change Rome from the kind of empire that had to expand to survive to one that can just stay at its present strength and survive. He actually spends a lot of time up in modern day France and Germany trying to make peace with the tribespeople there so that the wars, the endless wars in Gaul could finally end. And he gets there. He gets to that point and finally dies. And his son takes over. His son is Commodus. And if you've ever watched the movie Gladiator or the 1950s version of that movie, you will notice that Commodus is portrayed as a very self-serving, very poor leader of people and helps to begin the end of the Roman Empire. And those are all somewhat accurate. You know, Commodus was not a good ruler and should never have been the ruler. Now, there is this story that in and it's a story that's carried on in the films, in both films, about these characters, that the emperor actually picked his favorite general to be the next emperor and not his son Commodus, and that Commodus had that general killed. And then there's this whole kind of conspiracy theory that comes from that. We have zero evidence of any of that stuff happening. I like to think it did because it's fun. But the reality is that, you know, like you might expect with an empire, the son, Commodus, of the emperor, it becomes the next emperor, and he does a poor job. So all the way up through Marcus Aurelius, you've got political stability, military dominance of the Romans, economic prosperity for pretty much everybody who inside of the empire. So it's a very Renaissance era of time where a lot of discoveries are made scientifically, religions are able to prosper. Even Christianity has already begun, and it's not being prosecuted that much until we get to Commodus. I wanted to show you this too. This is, when we study world history, we often study this at some point because historians like to find a way to make the rise and fall of empires make sense and kind of a narrative. I think you could apply this to any society. The reason why it's the mandate of heaven / Chinese dynastic cycle is that China and all the kingdoms and empires of China have been around for so long so long without being conquered by other groups, just kind of rising and falling and rising and falling in this cycle, that we can trace it. And it's the only real society on earth where we could trace it this way, because it's been around forever, it seems like, And so the deal is that it starts here. A new dynasty takes over. And this, I think it could be applied to the United States. Where in this chart are we right now as the United States? I'm not going to say anything about that. I just wanted to bring that up because this seems to be the graphic summary of human societies. So a new kingdom or new society, like an American War of Independence or whatever, brings peace. You have infrastructure building, you have land being given to peasants, or the poor are able to flourish in this society, right? In fact, the peasants might have been the one that actually fought for the new dynasty, right? People are protected and things are peaceful. And for 100 years, maybe 200 years, things go well in that system until you get to where the typical old dynasty begins. The taxes are too high. The government stops protecting the people. Roads and walls are falling apart. People are being treated unfairly because of all the politics involved in this system. The old dynasty, therefore, loses what's called the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven, from a Chinese viewpoint, when we look at ancient China, the mandate of heaven can be translated in American English as basically being the will of the people. However, the mandate of heaven might have been also kind of a religious, the will of the gods. The gods support this dynasty, and then the gods don't support this dynasty. And when the gods no longer support that dynasty, the dynasty loses. Well, in our society here in America, we would basically say, that the people supported the new dynasty and what it did and the prosperousness of it and how it worked. And then things just got to a point where it didn't work anymore. And when it stopped working, it loses the trust of the people and the gods if you're a godly society. Then problems start to happen that happened before. It's just that the government can handle it. But now problems happen that the government can't handle. So floods and earthquakes are things that happen, and now the government can't really figure out how to protect its people in those because the infrastructure has fallen apart. Peasants revolt because they're angry about things, and the government is unable to address the problems, and therefore the peasants are revolting because they're trying to solve the problems themselves. I might equate that to things like militias and stuff. Invaders attack the empire, and the empire can't really stop them because it's no longer effective anymore. Bandits and raiders inside of the country are no longer being stopped by law enforcement because the law enforcement itself is falling apart. So things have just gotten old. The new dynasty has become the old dynasty. And then eventually there is a type of movement, an independence movement that overthrows the old dynasty and replaces it with a new dynasty that fits the new society, the people who need things to get better. And they'll fight maybe a revolution for this. And then the cycle repeats over and over and over. And Rome is going to be no different. America will be no different. The British Empire, no different. Everything happens in this kind of cycle. I guess that's just the way humans are. So there's this crisis as we get to the 3rd century, to around 200 Common Era. All right, there's this crisis where the mandate of heaven has been kind of lost. You've got Commodus and the other emperors after him basically just let the empire rot. They're not good leaders, and nobody's really effectively stopping them from becoming leaders. The guard, the royal guard, is no longer able to really stop those emperors after a while. Things have just gotten bad and the empire has started to rot. So there's a whole slew of new barbarian invasions. We call them the Huns. And the Huns are beginning to invade into parts of the frontier of the Roman Empire. And so the Roman armies and the garrisons at way out there in the frontier are getting pushed back in the eastern side and the northern side of the empire. There's this Iranian dynasty that also moves into Mesopotamia and starts fighting the Roman borderlands there as well. So there's this Iranian dynasty, and there's the Huns. And the Roman Empire is already having infrastructure problems, so it's starting to collapse already on the extremities. So all the attacks of different barbarian groups went out. Now I said the Huns, right? And yet you don't see a lot of words here that say Huns. And there's a reason for that. When you look at the Saxons, the Franks, the Vandals, the Alemanni, the Jutes, the Visigoths, right? All these guys. Why are they all invading into the empire instead of staying out here where they were happy? The reason why that's happening is because the Huns are out here. And the Huns keep on attacking these guys. So these guys running away from the Huns are going into the empire because the empire itself is getting weak, at least along the borders. And they can either die at the hands of the Huns or they can invade the Roman Empire and hope that they can find a way to live there. And the Romans are having trouble figuring out what to do about it. So you can see even here the Vandals are really something else, right? The Vandals way out here, these guys coming out of Germany. It's always coming out of Germany. Way out here are moving along this way, and they invade all the way into Spain and make it all the way to ancient Carthage, the ruins there. And from there by sea, they strike out and start attacking all these Roman territories. These Vandals are kind of like the Vikings in the way that they work. The Goths are the actual ancestors of the Vikings, right? And they're moving out. The Jutes and Angles and Saxons and Franks, these guys all the way up here are going into Britain, and the Romans have to leave Britain finally because they can't just stop fighting all these guys, right? It's just all these people between 100 and 500 are coming in, these tribal groups, and they're all being chased in by the Huns. So let's finish this up then. 235 to 285 Common Era. 20 emperors will hold power. That's 35 to 85 of the same century. So that's not many years. And over 20 different people hold power because one comes, gets assassinated, the next comes, gets assassinated, the next comes, dies, next comes, gets assassinated. So the point is, guys, is that this is a very turbulent time between 235 to 285. And during that time, not only is the empire collapsing internally with the lack of leadership, but the people on the outside are coming in as well without much resistance. So all power now. The Senate's really not doing anything by the time we get to 285. So all power is in the hands of the emperor. The Senate is just kind of gone. Two distinct. There's the aristocrats who are basically living in fortified mansions in the countryside. They've moved out of the city and they're in fortified mansions. And then you've got all the lower classes. And no longer is it the patricians and the plebs. It's the people with money that are hiding. And there's the lower classes who are just left to kind of, labor in Rome and other cities as those cities fall apart around them. So the collapse is already coming. But this note here, the star. This situation foreshadows the social system of the Middle Ages. This is a good point to make because what happens is these lower classes tend to flank around the fortified mansions that these aristocrats set up in the countryside to kind of live out their lives in safety away from the frontiers of Rome and away from the Roman government. And what that means is that you've basically got a feudal medieval system where lower class people serve the aristocrats in their manors in return for protection. And that's the medieval feudal system that's going to emerge out of the Roman Empire. So people obviously are going to be losing confidence in the Roman system. Roman money, the inflation was so bad with Roman money because of the habit of putting less and less gold in it, that what ends up happening is that Roman money becomes basically worthless. So that means that people are bartering instead of using a system of coinage, which means that the tax system breaks down. On top of the tax system breaking down, the wealthy refuse to pay taxes. You might notice that wealthy people tend to hate paying taxes. And so they find ways to, in the modern day, to put money into offshore accounts or to influence presidents and congresses to change the laws so that the taxes are much less for them than they are for anybody else. And there's lots of hidden loopholes in corporations and whatnot, so people like Jeff Bezos can make something like, I want to say, tens of millions of dollars per day, but not pay much in the way of taxes on any of that money. Why can they do this? Because the governments have kind of let them do it. And so we're in the system where right now we're seeing people with just a huge amount of wealth, people that make 300% over what their next highest paid employee makes in major corporations, which never would have been the case 20 years ago. And we're doing it now because our society is kind of doing that. It's in this transition where we're letting wealthy people basically govern us as opposed to letting the government govern us. And that leads to this kind of cycle where we start to lose our faith in the system of government and start to then look to the super rich to do things that the government's not doing. That's where we are in our cycle of the mandate of heaven. And I sure as heck hope we can see some change in that system. Well, here we are with the Romans, okay? Wealthy refusing to pay taxes, moving out of the cities and hiding themselves away in their estates. And it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse because you have a lot of just ineffective leaders that can't fix it. They just won't fix it. More crises. As the wealthy continue to refuse to pay taxes. Oh, we already talked about this. Sorry. So the plebeians end up serving as serfs and slaves to the patricians, is what's really happening now. And that, again, is my point about feudalism. So what happens? Environmental problems that the government cannot deal with because it has no money, because people aren't paying taxes. So plague, famine, soil exhaustion. There's also possibly a climate shift happening at this point in time, and the empire continues to fall apart. So we call this the tent effect. The empire had gotten so big that it could not sustain itself under bad management. Sometimes you can get a slate of bad managers, bad rulers, bad governments, and you do fine. But sometimes you get a bunch of bad rulers right when invaders are coming and the weather changes and you have a plague, right? And all this together means that you can't maintain yourself. So how do the last emperors try to fix this? Okay, there's a guy named Diocletian who is going to split the empire into two pieces. In 294, he's going to try to salvage what's left of the Roman Empire. So he splits the empire up, and you've got a Latin emperor over here, and you've got a kind of Greek style emperor over here. So in Constantinople, the city of Constantinople, you have got Diocletian living right here. And over here, you've got another guy named Emperor Maximilian over here. Not even in Rome. He's got his own capital up here, by the way, just so you see that. The idea of this, of course, is that hopefully it'll be a lot easier for an emperor to manage this than all of this, right? And same over here. Christianity is rising at the same time as the emperor is collapsing. It starts off as a cult that is worshipped underground in old temples that were usually dedicated to Mithras, another god, and also is being worshipped in catacombs and that sort of thing. A number of emperors, actually, like Nero, prosecuted, I should say persecuted, really, Christians because they feared that Christianity was actually undermining their rule. And it's because the deal is that Christianity gives hope to people for an afterlife. That's kind of one of the major tenets of the religion. And if you're living in a collapsing empire where things are just getting really bad, all right, if you're living in this, then maybe your hope is for an afterlife, something that you get after living a good life on earth, and suffering. And because people were suffering so much, Christianity looks really good. It's a way to connect people together in communion and to try to kind of build communities based on religion while offering a promise of something better when you die, right? And so that's something that is moving along secretly on its own very, very well. And it brings these ideas in that the Romans have become too cynical to understand anymore. The ideas of love, compassion, relationship with God that leads to communities. And that's just something that happens in different parts of the Roman Empire, which is why, as Rome collapses, Christianity grows. So many leaders, as I mentioned, were afraid of Christianity, so they did everything they could to kill off the Christians, right? And that's just going to be its own problem because Christianity is going to really, as I said before, be successfully adopted by those who have nothing else. And there's a lot of people in the crumbling empire that literally have nothing else. So eternal salvation, hope in time of crisis, equality of all people, right? Which made sense to folks at a time when the super rich basically ran their own kingdoms away from any government. The importance of charity, which is also a big deal when you have a lot of really, really poor people. Enthusiasm of the martyrs, those who will suffer and die for Christ. Well, people are going to suffer and die no matter what in this kind of situation, a collapsing empire where folks are blaming each other for everything, and there's lots of rioting and fighting, and the Gauls and Visigoths are coming in to kill you and take over. So while all that's happening, you're going to have lots of martyrs. So why not make those people folks that you can look up to, right? Why are some reasons that Christians were persecuted? They did not worship the emperor as a god. They did not attend gladiatorial games and Roman festivals that were basically non-Christian in identity. The Christians would not serve in the Roman army. They were kind of pacifist at the time. My, how things have changed. And Christians' festivals and customs were seen as very strange to the Romans. One of those is communion. If you've ever heard of this, this is the idea of breaking bread and having wine, and these two are infused through this thing called communion as the body and blood of Christ. And the Romans, who were really traditional Romans, didn't kind of understand that. They thought that the Christians were cannibals and were literally eating people and drinking their blood as the body and blood of Christ in communion. This is a whole other story that I'm not going to get into because this is not a theology class, but that's just kind of what's going on here. All right. So the impact of Constantine. All right. Constantine is going to be this emperor that's pretty powerful. He's pretty strong, does a good job securing the borders of what's left of the empire. He moves the official capital of Rome to Byzantium, basically to Constantinople. Okay, in 330 Common Era. He does this because there's way more opportunity in Constantinople in the middle of the entrance into the Black Sea. There's way more opportunity for trade and commerce and for military defense there. And basically what he's doing is he's abandoning Rome, which is a big mess. And called a pagan city plagued with problems. The deal is that Rome was basically just in collapse. So Constantine, instead of fixing it, just left. He just left Rome and went to a new city over there off the Black Sea and called it Constantinople after himself. And he is going to convert the entire empire to Christianity, by the way. So he's the first emperor to really take on Christianity as a way to basically hold the empire, what's left of it, together. So Constantinople becomes the second Rome. By the way, these minarets are added by the Muslims after they conquer Constantinople in 1453. So that was not something the Romans built. The Romans did build this, though, the Hagia Sophia, a beautiful place that is sometimes a mosque now and sometimes a museum. It just depends. So Constantine declares Christianity the official religion of the empire. Okay, calls the First Council of Nicaea, which is how the church's doctrine begins. So the Nicene Creed, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. Basically, the idea of what was going to be in the Bible, what the actual doctrine of the original Catholic Church was going to be as a arm of the Roman Empire of the time, is decided at the Council of Nicaea at the behest of Constantine. By the way, if you're interested in this stuff, ultimately the council cannot decide what what stories to actually put into the Bible, especially the New Testament that was going to be published. And so what they did was there was this one guy, this one priest, who actually just said, "Hey, here, can we just here's my version. Would you guys like this? Here, here's the stories I think that are good. We're going to leave out all these other stories, like the stories about Jesus Christ being married and that sort of thing. We're going to leave all that stuff out, and we're going to just have these stories here, and that'll become the Bible. What do you guys think?" And the church just said, "Sounds good," and that became the Bible. I know that's kind of a loose way to talk to tell you about that, but it is a thing. All right, so the power of the Catholic Church. As the Christian population grew, so did the power of the church and its officials. Eventually, the highest office of the Roman Catholic Church becomes the papacy, which existed alongside the Pope. But as the Roman Empire collapses, what's going to happen is the papacy of the Catholic Church is going to be kind of like the replacement of the empire. Ultimately, instead of having a Roman emperor, you're going to have the Pope that rules the Roman Catholic Church. And the people that believe in Christianity over that of an ancient falling apart empire are going to do that. And the Gauls, the Visigoths, the Britons, everybody eventually on that side of the world converts to Christianity. So instead of having a empire fighting against all these other people, what you have is an empire that's crumbling and a religious empire that's growing to take it over. So the new mandate of heaven, the new empire that's going to replace the falling and crumbling Roman Empire, will be the Catholic Church. And it starts out small and then expands and overtakes that entire area known as Western Europe over the course of a couple hundred years. It's just it does it religiously as opposed to doing it through a bunch of different kings. I don't know. That's probably not even the most accurate thing to say. So the spread of Christianity, here it is. Doesn't it look a lot like the borderlands of the empire under Trajan? Look at that. It looks just like an empire. And who's it ruled by? The Pope. Ta-da! So the Roman Empire, as long as the Catholic Church exists, never really went away. It just sort of transitioned. It kind of fell apart, yes, but the ideas of it, the concepts that the Romans left to us, the legacies of Rome, are going to be encapsulated in the Roman Catholic Church, and that church is going to expand throughout and basically re-extend the Roman Empire through religion. And so it starts with these enclaves, little cities and churches, and these enclaves of Christianity that eventually expand, and you have all these people in all these regions who are basically converted Christians, right? I think that's kind of interesting. So that's kind of the transition that happens as the Roman Empire changes from being a solid empire to basically a religious organization, if you will. All right, a little bit about what's left of the empire over in the east, because eventually the Roman Empire of the west will fall apart and be taken over by Gallic tribes who will convert to Christianity and kind of rejoin as Christians as opposed to as parts of Rome. But there's this guy named Emperor Justinian, and Emperor Justinian, he rules this side. He rules over here. And so he's in charge of the Eastern Roman Empire. And one of the reasons why the Eastern Roman Empire never goes away is because guys like Justinian were very good at what they did. And they managed to continue on the Roman military and aristocratic tradition over here for a very long time. Meanwhile, this entire side, the Western Roman Empire, collapses into a number of pagan and then eventually Christian kingdoms. So the Franks, who will eventually become the Germans, the Austrians, and the French, the Angles and the Saxons that eventually become the Anglo-Saxons, i.e., England, right? You've got over here the Visigoths who invade here and meld with the Romans there to eventually create what will become Spain, the Vandals. All right, all these guys here take over these Germanic and Celtic kingdoms. And over here, you still have Rome, the Eastern Roman Empire under Constantinople. And Justinian will be kind of the guy that follows emperors like Constantine to hold things together and make this a very strong kingdom. the Byzantine Kingdom, which is also known as the Eastern Roman Empire. So this is one of the things that Justinian builds, which is this part minus the minarets, which were added later. This beautiful Hagia Sophia, which was a Christian palace and will later in 1453 be converted into a mosque. But guys, you can still go in there today, and all the Byzantine motifs and all that are still up there. The old Eastern Roman motifs are still there, and to the credit of the Islamic armies that captured Constantinople in 1453, they didn't destroy anything in here. They just covered up stuff that didn't fit with their religion. So underneath these symbols, these plaques here, are the original Byzantine Christian symbologies, which I think is pretty darn decent of them. So the legacy of the Roman Empire, aqueducts that the other kingdoms coming after the Romans will eventually figure out how to build and maintain. They don't for a while. The sewage systems, the dams, cement, the archways that you can build tunnels with and entrances. These are all things that the Romans either invented or furthered along. And yes, cement. This is cement. This is Roman style cement. They figured that out. So we got a lot from the engineering. Also, the idea of language. Latin is going to be what connects the Western world together and parts of the Eastern world as well for a long time, thanks to the Romans. The Catholic Church and Christianity, for whatever you might think of its legacy, is something that comes out of the collapse of Rome. All kinds of phrases that guys like Shakespeare pick up on, law and politics. We base so much, even in the United States, off of the Roman political and economic systems. It's not even funny. So the deal is, oh, and I have to mention this. This is, for those of you that are familiar with Latin, you will see this. But this here, if you read it in English directly, Veni, Vidi, Vici. And of course, it's real famous because Caesar said this after he beat a very powerful king. And Julius Caesar says, I came, I saw, I conquered. And that's a very Julius Caesar thing to say. Now, to our ears, it doesn't sound right. It sounds okay if you're like, Vidi, Vidi, Vici. But if you say it in the actual Latin, the way it's pronounced, the V is a W, you guys. Winnie, Winnie, Vici. It doesn't work well for us. I guess you should try though. You should walk around the next time you do something where you feel like you play a game of Overwatch or something or Civilization and you win and then go Winnie Winnie Weechi. I don't know. I can't say it and take it seriously. But anyway, we get a lot of these phrases, of course, from the Romans. A lot of these ideas, right? Roman Catholicism, European unity. There are going to be kings and emperors that come after the Romans that try to recreate the ideals of the Roman Empire. Charlemagne of the Franks is going to be one of them. The popes of Rome are going to continue to try to continue kind of Roman ideals during their time. The even guys like Napoleon, and to a very small extent, Mussolini and Hitler were trying to reestablish the greatness of the Roman Empire in their own way. And of course, they had some really weird ways to do it that were not so great. But, Roman legacy still exists. Anyway, let's call that good. Thanks a lot. And we'll see you as we start getting into the rise of Islam and getting into Western European medieval stories. See you soon.